Welcome learners. In this capsule, we will discuss the various policies and frameworks on inclusive education. After going through this lecture, the learners will be able to understand the global milestones. That is, they'll be able to equip themselves with an in-depth understanding of the foundational international treaties, the global milestones such as the Salamanca Statement, the UNCRPD, and Sustainable Development Goal 4, which codifies inclusion as a universal human right. These have paved the path for inclusion in education across the globe. Similarly, after going through this lecture, the learners will also understand about the national mandates pertaining to the Indian context. They will be able to analyze how the Indian constitutional structures, landmark disability legislations such as the RPWD Act of 2016 and the latest NEP 2020 implement structural frameworks as well as actual policy readjustments to bridge the societal divides and spread inclusion not only in education but across the Indian society. Let us briefly look at the historical evolution of special needs education. In the very first segment, which we can call segregation, that is in the pre-1970s era, the learners with disabilities were isolated or they were separated in special schools based purely on a medical deficit model. Therefore, they were identified vis-a-vis their disabilities and accordingly they were isolated and separated in special schools. Next, during 1970s to 1980s, we can talk about the integration phase. During this phase, the learners with impairments were gradually placed into mainstream institutions where they were expected to adapt to static mainstream systems. So, from isolation and segregation, they are now being integrated into the mainstream educational institutions. Then, post 1994 phase, we can talk about the phase of inclusion. During this phase, the whole system was restructured. The school infrastructure, the educational policies as well as frameworks were adapted. The curriculum was redesigned and the pedagogy was also adapted to celebrate the learners' diversity and to promote inclusion. Here we can talk about the beginning of inclusive practices in education from this particular phase. And then finally, we move on to the phase of radical inclusion, that is the present modern era of 21st century, where education has moved beyond simple accommodation for full equity. But now, inclusive practices are such that they ensure the belonging and social cohesion for all historically marginalized groups, including learners with special needs. Therefore, from the post-1994 period of the beginning of inclusion to today's radical inclusion and actual inclusive practices across education and society have ensured that the learners with special needs as well as all marginalized groups are bound in a cohesive framework of policies, institutions and practices that will promote true inclusion and holistic development across the population groups. If we are to trace the beginning of this journey, we can talk about the Salamanca Statement of 1994, which was a global turning point. Adopted in Salamanca, Spain under UNESCO, this historic document, the Salamanca Statement, represented a global consensus establishing inclusive education as a binding mandate. Therefore, it was no longer an option but a mandate required for all the signatories to follow. The Salamanca Statement declared that every child has a fundamental right to learn, emphasizing that regular schools with an inclusive ethos are the most effective means of combating discriminatory attitudes and creating welcoming, cohesive communities. Thus, the Salamanca Statement was a global turning point as well as the initiating point to move towards true inclusion in education. Moving further, in 2006, we can talk about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the UN CRPD, which also mandated a legally binding framework on all its signatories. Specifically, Article 24 of the UN CRPD promoted inclusive education. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities represented a monumental paradigm shift from charity-based models to human rights-based models. Specifically, Article 24 of the UN CRPD mandates that the state parties or the signatories must guarantee an inclusive educational system at all levels of education, starting from the basic primary to the upper levels and finally the higher educational levels. This ensures reasonable accommodation. It ensures that the existing structures support individual learning across groups. Therefore, individual support structures and the provisions of localized communication systems such as the Braille system or the Indian Sign Language systems are reasonably accommodated amongst the institutions, the frameworks and the policies of education. Therefore, through the UN CRPD, the standard of right to education was standardized across the globe. Similarly, we know about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Specifically, we can talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is about creating inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. This particular goal focus targets to complete SDG 4 by 2030, ensuring equitable learning outcomes. Although the goal is up to 2030, but presently certain goals have been achieved to a substantial extent. For example, across the globe, nearly 45% of universal education access and retention has been achieved so far. Similarly, inclusive infrastructure and ramps in schools, colleges and universities have been achieved across 30% of institutions. Similarly, 15% teachers training and pedagogy reformulations have been adopted and 10% lifelong vocational learning practices have been adopted. So we see that although universal access and retention or inclusive infrastructure has growth to a substantial extent or a considerable extent, but compared to that, the training of the teachers, the reformulations of the curriculum and pedagogy, as well as the policies of lifelong vocational learning practices still have a long path to go to achieve SDG 4. Therefore, we can say policies and frameworks such as UN CRPD or SDG Goal 4 have paved the path for global inclusion in education. However, there is still a long way to complete this journey. Let us briefly look at the Indian context through the constitutional safeguards of India. The basic part 3 of the Constitution, fundamental rights, actually guarantees this right to education in India. The fundamental right under Article 21A, which was inserted by the 86th Constitutional Amendment Act 2002, guarantees free and compulsory education for all children between the ages of 6 to 14. This paved the foundation, the legal scope for explicitly bringing children from diverse communities and across diverse abilities into the educational forum irrespective of their socio-economic backgrounds. Similarly, the equality clauses under the fundamental rights of our constitution under Article 14 and 15 also ensure equality and fair treatment. Article 14 ensures equality before law. Article 15 prohibits any sort of systemic discrimination. Therefore, the modern judicial interpretation of these constitutional provisions also protect the persons with physical or neurodevelopmental conditions, thereby laying the foundations of true equality and inclusion. Similarly, we can talk about two landmark legislations in the Indian context, the Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995 and the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. The former focused mostly on the medical deficits of disability, whereas the RPWD focused on human rights and the social model which is aligned with the UN CRPD. Whereas the Persons with Disabilities Act identified only 7 categories of disability, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act expanded this to 21 categories including learning disabilities. Also, the reservation which was provided under the PWD Act was only 3%, which was increased under the RPWD Act up to 5%, mandating absolute accessibility in education. And finally, the Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995 was a vague framework and lacked any statutory power for implementation, whereas the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016 has strict punitive actions for structural exclusions or discrimination, thereby implementing inclusion in a much more just and rigorous fashion. Therefore, if we can focus briefly on the latest RPWD Act of 2016, we can talk about certain provisions such as Section 16, which says that schools must provide admission without any discrimination and also offer equal learning environments to all children. We can talk about Section 17, which mandates systemic structural reforms to create barrier-free architectural design, accessible transport, and customized educational materials for learners. And also Section 18, which requires local authorities to design, fund, and support individualized learning programs to promote reasonable accommodation. Thereby, we can clearly see how the RPWD Act of 2016 has moved a long way to promote inclusion in education. Similarly, the Right to Education Act, the RTE Act of 2009, has also founded certain structural pillars of inclusion through the zero rejection policy, that is, no mainstream regular school can deny admission to a child of special needs, or the Section 12(1)(c) reservation, which mandates that private unaided schools must also reserve at least 25% of entry-level seats for children belonging to disadvantaged groups. And also, this Right to Education Act promoted alternative modes of education, which offers flexible frameworks for home-based education and also examinations. Therefore, the RTE Act also paved the founding pillars for inclusion, which was further enhanced by the New Education Policy 2020, which was a vision of the socio-economically disadvantaged groups and promoted true inclusion. Through the NEP 2020, the goals such as gender identities, that is targeted funding for girls as well as transgender learners, the target of social cultural groups where specific pedagogical strategies were aimed to counter discrimination and counter exclusion faced by socio-cultural groups, as well as the NEP's target of promoting diverse abilities, that is explicitly aligning the educational policy with the RPWD Act of 2016, prioritized cross-disability learning, trained teachers and accessible digital curriculum tools, thereby promoting universal design for learning. The NEP 2020 endorsed the integration of the UDL, Universal Design for Learning, replacing the standard one-size-fits-for-all pedagogical model. Here, the focus shifted to representation, that is delivering content which are relevant and varied across textual, visual and tactile modes. It focused on engagement, that is creating customized motivators matching student-specific focused learning, and also the UDL focused on expression, that is allowing alternative assessments including oral portfolios and digital presentations so learners with disabilities or learners with special abilities can express themselves without following the traditional methods of education. Therefore, this policy shift through the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan is a foundational journey that has been promoted by the central government. This centrally sponsored scheme of the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan provides direct financial assistance to schools and local authorities, thereby making the institutions and classrooms truly exclusive. The direct resource allocations under the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan has been an effective means to overcome environmental and pedagogical barriers as well as to build capacity and follow RCI directives. The directives of the Rehabilitation Council of India is very important to understand because it governs the quality and licensing of special education teachers. In accordance with the RCI Act of 1992, all working special teachers must be registered and of course they must be well trained. This further promotes cross-disability specialization, shifting teachers' training from single disability focus to multi-disability competences to tackle contemporary diverse classroom learners' demands. And finally, it also integrates into the mainstream educational system. The mandatory modules on basic special needs and screening educational adjustments integrates the B.Ed and M.Ed programs to promote capacity building and true inclusion across educational institutions in India. Therefore, to conclude, we must acknowledge that we have to bridge the gaps in policy realization to truly overcome the structural and attitudinal obstacles that are present today. Severe shortage of specially trained teachers or special educators and accessibility tools and structures across institutions, especially rural learning institutions, need to be bridged. Similarly, school complexes need to be organized in special areas. The geographic distances has to be reduced to promote inclusive practices and to promote the accommodation of vulnerable children. Not only structural obstacles, but also the attitudinal shifts need to happen. The unconscious or subconscious bias among education and peers leads to academic marginalization, which can be overcome through proper sensitization. Furthermore, we must also move from the rigid traditional examination parameters to flexible, continuous and formative assessments so that children with special needs can be accommodated, and the educational boards have to also readjust their examination patterns accordingly. This continuous formative assessment models will further promote flexible assessment for learners across all groups. Thereby, to understand inclusion, we can conclude by a quotation of Swami Vivekananda, and I quote, "We want that education by which the character is formed, strength of mind is increased, the intellect is expanded, and by which one can stand by one's own feet." And to realize these words of Swami Vivekananda, we must adopt inclusive practices for a diverse society in present day contexts.